Hello, Alex here, and in this video I want to share my thoughts on the Pentax 17, a brand new half-frame film camera from Ricoh that I was able to borrow for just about 2 weeks thanks to the folks at the Photoshop.ie, a long-time partner of my channel, which wasn't a super long time, so this is just a first impressions video, but long enough to decide that I love this camera, but won't be buying one. Let's get into it. Released in mid-2024 by Ricoh under the Pentax brand, this is the first in a brand new 21st century line of cameras from Pentax, one of the big players. Other people like Mint are making brand new film cameras as well at the moment, but this is Pentax we're talking about. Sure, they don't have the same household name kind of appeal as they did 20 years ago, but this is as big as Nikon giving us an FM4A or Canon giving you 24 frames per second video in a camera that can do 30 frames per second video. It shows Pentax's and Ricoh's commitment to photography, both with their, digging in their heels, keeping DSLRs alive, but also just analog photography in general and respecting their heritage and the resurgence of film. And this is a really big deal. Obviously I don't have the camera anymore, but in the 2 weeks that I had it, I shot 2 rolls of film. 1 roll of Phoenix and 1 roll of Cinestill 400D, both in Ireland and in Germany, across a decent spread of subjects and environments to get a good feel for the camera, but again, this is not a full review. The Pentax 17 is a half-frame camera, netting you twice as many shots per roll as a standard 35mm camera. The name comes from the 17mm wide negatives, and the camera natively shoots in the portrait orientation because the film is transported sideways like the vast majority of half-frame cameras. I call it a not quite point-and-shoot camera because it's not as fully automatic as something like a Mu or Mu 2, but it's not as manual as something like a Canonet. If you're expecting to be able to just point and click, it's not really that kind of camera. There is one mode where you can do that, the full auto mode, but then you're wasting a lot of the features that this camera has to offer. It's really intended more as a secondary camera for a more serious photographer or a big step up from a more beginner photographer. Coming in at about 130 by 80 by 55mm and weighing 320 grams with the battery and film loaded, this is a very small and petite camera. The top and bottom plates are made of magnesium alloy, and most of the rest of the body is made of varying qualities of plastic. The main feature on the front of the camera is of course the lens, a 25mm lens made of 3 elements in 3 groups. This gives you a field of view roughly equivalent to a 35mm lens on a full frame camera, so it's ideal as your one lens for everyday shooting. The aperture ranges from f3.5 down to f16, and you really have no control except in 2 modes. Auto mode, which will force it to f16, and the bokeh mode, which will force it to f3.5. There's a 40.5mm filter thread around the lens, and the light meter, which isn't TTL, is smartly placed within that ring, so if you're using, say, an ND filter to shoot with bokeh mode on bright days, or to use a yellow filter or an orange filter with black and white film to boost your contrast, you can do that and it will automatically compensate because it's behind the filter. Pentax do specifically say that infrared photography isn't possible with this camera though, because the meter isn't sensitive to any infrared light, unlike high-end flagship DSLRs from the likes of Canon and Nikon. The leaf shutter within the lens tops out at just 1/350th of a second, which is not super fast even for leaf shutters, and I don't know how low it will go natively, but in the bulb mode you can shoot in bulb mode. This is neither an SLR nor rangefinder camera, it's a scale focus camera like some compacts like the XA2 or a Holga camera, and that's one of the more contentious points. You guesstimate your distance to your subject and hope that you've just got it good enough and that the depth of field will cover you, which is usually fine with a half-frame camera. But you still don't necessarily see exactly where you're going to be focusing. It's not that precise. I mean, they do give you pictures and you can see those pictures through the viewfinder to give you a vague idea of where you're going. But the distances, which were included if you want to be a bit more precise, are on the bottom of the lens. So you have to remove your eye from the viewfinder if you want to take advantage of those. The front grip also serves as the battery compartment, and no surprises, this is an electronic camera that does require a battery. Just unscrew the grip and you can install a single CR2 cell to power the camera. Not the most common battery type, but not exactly difficult to get. The rear of the body has a memo holder to keep track of what film you have loaded in the camera, which is nice because there's no window to see the canister. And there is a cable release port, but it's the more modern 2.5mm electronic type and not a classical analog threaded cable release port, which might rub some people the wrong way. The Albada or Albeda type viewfinder is very bright, very large despite the small format, and very easy to see even with glasses. The bright line frame lines are always there and help you compose, and there are two sets. The larger set being for focusing at far distances, and the smaller set for focusing at close distances because there's no automatic parallax correction. Of course, because this is a scale focus camera with the leaf shutter, you're not looking through the lens, so you need those parallax correction markers to give you a vague idea of what your composition is going to be. Just to the right of the finder are two LED status lights that flash or blink or turn on in various different configurations to commute a ton of different things to you, and I never took advantage of those, but there is a chart in the manual if you want to learn what they actually mean. The only features on the sides of the camera are the strap lugs, and the top is where the rest of the good stuff is. There's a film rewind lever surrounded by an ISO dial, and that dial has a lock button to stop it getting bumped accidentally. The ISO settings to choose from are 50, 100, 125, 160, and then from 200 up to 3200 in full stop steps. Beside that is the exposure compensation dial, ranging from -2 to +2 EV in 1/3 steps to really help you dial in your exposure. This camera doesn't have one of those like backlight plus 1.5 EV buttons like some other cameras do, but you can just set that manually or with more precision, depending on what you want to do. On the other side of the viewfinder bump is the mode dial, and there's a lot going on here, but you can basically break it down into 3 banks. Auto mode is full auto and will do its own thing. The white modes will turn the flash off, and the yellow modes will turn the flash on. There's a lot going on here, and I basically just stuck to program mode with or without flash, and then the bokeh mode. In my opinion, the folks at Analog Wonderland explain the different modes better than the actual manual does, so do give their review a look. The shutter button has a light touch for the half press and a nice deep full press. I do prefer really clicky shutter buttons where you can tell exactly when or if you have pressed the shutter button or half pressed it, but here it's quite good as far as soft touch buttons go, and of course there is a giant lock switch around it, so you're not going to knock it accidentally. One of the key features of this camera, and something the Pentax engineers insisted on keeping, is a manual film advance lever. Some people ask me if this is a fake film advance lever because the throw is quite short, but it is actually legit. It's not like you're triggering an electronic circuit to advance the film for you, like with the Mint Instax cameras. It's real, and it feels really good. The last notable thing on the top plate is the frame counter, white on black, which I found easy to read under all sorts of conditions. And to round out the externals, the bottom plate has a standard 1/4-20 tripod socket and a button to unlock the film for rewinding. It's extremely lightweight and compact and very easy to keep with you. It's not going to fit in a jeans pocket, but as far as jackets go, I was able to keep it with me every single day that I had the camera. And like, if you're worried about the size of this thing in my hand, this is much larger than the actual camera. I've seen a lot of people say like, oh, it should be half the size because it's not a full frame camera. It's about 17mm narrower than it should be because you still need a film advance, a lens, a battery, the electronics to power the meter and the technical autofocus that I'll talk about later, and somewhere to put the film canister. There isn't that much space to squish down and actually save if you want a well-built camera, and it's about as small as it could reasonably be. For me, it's more important that the lens is very compact and the camera isn't very thick, so it fits like smoothly into a pocket and doesn't have a lens protruding. It's a new camera with a warranty and is from one of the big players. It's one thing to have, a small spin out from like a garden shed or a small office with 2 to 5 employees where, you can send the camera back, they'll do some calibrations, they might be able to help you, they might not. It's another thing when you're talking about a standard RMA procedure with thousands upon thousands of spare parts and repair techs to keep these things going. It's a whole other ballgame. It's just like Harmon Phoenix, and I feel like John Green talking about tuberculosis, always making everything about Phoenix. But it shows commitment from Pentax on a massive financial scale to keeping film alive and helping continue the resurgence that film's had in the last couple of years to keep film going. It's all about keeping the craft alive with folks like the Photoshop.ie, who provided me with this camera for 2 weeks, and that was the best segue I've ever had in one of these videos. The Photoshop stock a wide range of photographic products, including things that a lot of other bigger retailers don't, and their prices are highly competitive on the European market, so it might be worth checking them out even if you're on the continent or even further afield, with packages going as far away as Australia from time to time. Thanks again to the folks at the Photoshop.ie for loaning me this camera, and now I'm actually going to continue the video. Overall, the build quality is very solid. I mean, it's got a magnesium alloy top plate and bottom plate. 7 of the 9 people that I handed it to across the Cork Photo Walk and the trip to Germany, their immediate reaction was, oh, it feels really good, because it does. There are parts that are quite flimsy plastic, like the rear door doesn't feel that great, but the overall build quality is very, very good. I do think that Pentax were right to keep a film advance on this camera, because it makes it feel more tactile and like you're doing something, because you are. It's not just click and then an electronic motor goes and then you go on to the next frame. You're really involved in the process, and that is part of what they wanted to keep going with here. That's why they stick with DSLRs. You get the intimate experience of an optical viewfinder rather than just looking at another screen with an EVF. That's part of their whole package and their whole ethos. The light meter is extremely accurate, with only 2 shots coming out poorly exposed, where I couldn't put that down to things like me accidentally shooting in bulb mode or me shooting in program mode without flash indoors and it just not being able to handle that. Overall, it performed absolutely excellently. I mean, one of the rolls I shot was Phoenix. Phoenix has very little tolerance for over and under exposure, and almost all of the shots came out absolutely perfectly. I love the inclusion of both an ISO dial and an exposure compensation dial. One of the big sticking points when people come on to the various groups that I'm part of and ask for recommendations for point and shoot is they want some level of manual control. And that rules out so many cameras. You know, even just being able to set the ISO is huge, because you can use that as exposure compensation if you want. But with the 1/3 stops of the EV dial here, you can really dial that in. Aside from that, you can just use it for creative effect, like if you wanted to expose to the highlights, have a really moody, dramatic image, you can do that. Or if you want to make sure you don't lose shadow detail, you can force the camera to overexpose. It just gives you a bit more flexibility, which is great with such a broadly simple point and shoot-ish camera. The lens is sharp. Sure, it's a half frame camera and that limits your resolution, and it's a scale focus camera, so you might not get focus all the time. But when you nail it, the lens just hits so hard. The Ricoh engineers really know what they're doing, and they definitely went for it here. I've seen a lot of people online like buy a Pentax 17 closer to the launch from somewhere with a good returns policy in hope of putting a roll through it and then returning it if they didn't like it, and then end up keeping it because they go full Squidward like, oh no, it's good. I just find that absolutely hilarious. And that isn't a given in this product segment, you know, to have such a, it's not just a good lens, it's a very good lens. And that's a bit above and beyond what you might expect. Again, the viewfinder is very bright and easy to use, even with glasses. The parallax correction lines, which aren't apparently a given in 2024, the LED status indicator lights, the focus distance setting at the bottom of the finder, I can see everything all at once. And like, my glasses stick out quite far compared to a lot of other glasses because of the height of them. They have to clear my brow. The leaf shutter, of course, is very quiet. It's not a focal plane shutter, it's just a little tick. So it would be a great opportunity for street photography. People aren't going to be on edge around you, and they're not necessarily going to know if you've taken the picture. Lastly, of course, this is a half frame camera getting you twice as many shots per roll. I've seen a lot of people who said things like, I would have bought it if it were a full frame camera. And that's fair to a point, but I argue that the lens is sharp enough that you don't really need it. I'd rather have a good lens on a half frame camera than a bad lens on a full frame camera. And if this were a full frame camera, the lens would have to be bigger, there'd probably be more optical constraints. It just wouldn't be as tight a package, I feel. And it also, okay, let's be real, Pentax are making more cameras, that's another pro. This is the first in a line of cameras, and the next is going to be a premium compact. We don't yet know if that's going to be something like a 35 Ti ripoff, you know, Contax T2 kind of thing. But that will be a full frame camera, and it's probably just for market segmentation. Even so, I still think the lens is good enough that it's not a big deal. Getting twice as many frames per roll is always good by me. The maximum shutter speed of 1/350th of a second is a real bummer. The standard that a lot of people expect from a leaf shutter is 1/500th of a second. My large format lenses on the top of that shelf can do 1/400th and 1/500th, and they are much larger leaf shutters without electronics driving them. Sure, there are probably mechanical reasons for it, but if you've got ISO 800 or even ISO 400 film in the camera on a bright day, f16, which is the narrowest aperture, might not be dark enough, and not everybody wants to carry an ND around just to work around the limitations of the shutter. At 550 to 600 euros in most regions, it is an expensive camera, especially for, as most people would see it, a half-frame point and shoot. It's not quite a point and shoot, but I get where they're coming from. The fact is, materials are expensive. Ever since 2020, the price of metals and plastics has basically exploded. The price of labor has gone up tremendously. Inflation has driven everything up. You want a new camera, you gotta pay what it costs to make a new camera. People want an all-metal camera with autofocus made in Japan, and then don't want to pay for that. It's not quite delusional, but it's not realistic. The fact is, it's an expensive camera, but it's not overpriced. The price is very easily justified with the high-quality lens, the magnesium top and bottom plate, the inclusion of the film advance lever, the funds going towards the next step in this project. But that doesn't change the fact that it costs a lot of money to buy one. It's very easy to knock the mode dial out of place. There were a few times where I was like taking the camera in and out of my bag or into my jacket pocket, and that was enough to change the position of the dial. But it's the only one that moves that easily. The exposure compensation dial sits way more sturdily, and of course the ISO dial has a lock, but the exposure compensation has like deeper detents and holds its position a lot better. And I would rather it be the other way around, because there were a few times where I moved from like program mode all the way into bulb mode and ended up burning nice compositions with, nuclear burned frames. Actually firing the shutter is a little bit laggy with this camera. Even if you half press and you would think that would get all the metering and the thinking done out of the way, when you fully depress the shutter, there's still like a fraction of a second delay before it fires, and it's like maybe a fifth to a quarter of a second. And that's enough to throw things off sometimes. It's not as snappy as I would have expected. And for like street photography, there were a few shots where it's easy for me to tell you they would have been amazing if not for the camera. But there was a shutter delay and someone just moved into the wrong position of the frame, or they were too deep into the frame on a bike, and it just kind of threw some of the shots off. So for candid kind of stuff, it's absolutely perfect. For fast-paced shooting, this isn't really going to be the right kind of camera, even if the scale focus and the half-frame format suit your needs. One of my biggest gripes with this camera, and it's not something you would encounter often, but it's something I don't see anyone else talking about, is that the screw for the grip to change out the battery isn't a captive screw. So when you unscrew it, it just falls out. So if the battery is something you have to change in the field on a trip or something, it's not entirely impossible that you're gonna lose that screw and not be able to reattach the grip. It's not like it clips in any way and the screw is just to secure it. The grip is fully held on by that screw, and if it's gone, it's gone. The camera kind of feels like it insults your intelligence sometimes. There's a lot of great technology and great design here, and I know the design of the overall aesthetic is a bit polarizing. Again, I love it. But things like calling the wide aperture mode bokeh mode, it's a bit, how do you woo, fellow Sigmas? It's just a bit cringy, to be honest. And things like having ISO 125 to ISO 160 on the dial, but not 80 or 250 or 500, only whole stops outside the 100 to 200 range. It's a bit like, we accept you are intelligent and attractive enough to shoot FP4 and Portra 160, but 250D, 500T and, Ilford Ortho 80, no, that's way beyond you. You're not a real photographer, you can't shoot those. And you could do it with exposure compensation if you wanted to, but just include all of the 1/3 stops around the dial, there's tons of space, or include none of them and let people just use exposure comp or just the latitude of their film. Lastly, of course, being scale focus is the most contentious thing for a lot of people. The half frame thing has pissed off a lot of people, I would say unjustifiably. Scale focus I can more understand. Even with any other compact camera, not being able to see through the lens, having to deal with parallax correction, that's completely normal. But scale focus means you're going to miss focus with quite a few shots, especially with lower ISO films or in dimmer environments where you're not in the California desert. Missing those shots can completely undo the economy of having a half frame camera in the extreme case. And I get why a lot of people wouldn't buy this camera for that reason. So those are my thoughts on the 2 weeks I had with the Pentax 17. In the same vein as Harman Phoenix, good morning Hank, this is a big move from one of the big players and a significant investment into film, and that is probably the most important thing here. I know a lot of people with a lot more disposable income who have bought 1 or 2 of these cameras just to support the project, and more power to them. I think Pentax need the support to show that we are responsive to this kind of thing. It's small, it's light, the lens is excellent, the meter is excellent, the ergonomics are genuinely something I really enjoy, as well as the design, as quirky and dorky as it is. It's not going to be a camera for a lot of people, and I completely justify that, even ignoring the price, which is going to price out a lot of people. That's totally fair. Again, it's expensive, but I don't think it's overpriced. If it were like 150 euros cheaper or had autofocus, I probably would have kept it and not given it back to the folks at the Photoshop, who again, thanks for letting me loan this camera. But for me, it's just not the right kind of camera. I would rather spend less money and get something older myself, take a risk, or buy from a dealer, somewhere that actually tests cameras, not mint plus, whatever. That said, if you're looking for a point and shoot kind of camera, I guess you could look at something like the Mint, the Rollei 35AF, which a lot of people compare this camera to, but from what I've seen from the early reviews, this thing has a lot of features that thing doesn't, and that thing's a few €100 more expensive. But it has autofocus, and it's full frame. But yeah, this camera actually does kind of have autofocus. So when you turn the focus ring, you're not actually changing the position of the lens, but when you half press the shutter, the lens moves electronically. And that makes me think that Pentax are using this as a proof of concept for the motors that they would use in the autofocus compact down the line, which shows confidence in the project and is something I think is a good sign. But we'll talk about those future cameras if I ever get to try them when they exist. There's no point talking about them too much now. That's all I have to say for today about the Pentax 17. So stay safe, and bye-bye for now. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Shako1277 for new pictures every day. If you liked this video and enjoy what I do on the channel, please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon, where the tiers start at just €1 per month.